Hello everyone, welcome back to Environmental Science. This is week 3. So again, we're just going to cruise through some important topics that I think maybe need just a little bit further explanation, and we'll see if we can get it done in the next 15 minutes. So we're going to talk about a number of different things in this chapter. You can see on this slide here. So the concept of evolution is something that we understand more abundantly these days from modern genetics. Essentially, various bacteria. Bacteria, and you'll see this in a chart, you can produce upwards of 20 to 30 generations of bacteria within the matter of hours, producing millions of bacteria offspring, where you can see minute changes in the DNA of the bacteria. And so that's a lot of what is studied these days to understand the mechanism behind evolution. However, our understanding of evolutionary history of organisms throughout time is based upon the fossil record. So there is a difference between how we've come to understand the process of evolution and our record of evolutionary changes. The fossil record, unfortunately, is sparse. We don't have a record for the minute changes from one species into another, but we can, especially through modern genetics, understand how variation happens. And variation happens through the process of natural selection. So a lot of times people think that it's only the strongest survive, the strongest of muscle, the strongest of mind, and that's not essentially the truth of natural selection. The truth of natural selection is that the organisms with the best characteristics for survival live on. So there are minor genetic differences among all of us, and in the case where we are faced with environmental stressors, climate change, natural disasters, maybe toxic chemicals, or who knows, ice ages, freezing temperatures, all these different things are environmental stressors, and we either have the genetic makeup to be adaptable or we don't. Those who have the genetic makeup to be able to survive the environmental stressor, those are the organisms that are going to live on. And the ones that don't have the necessary characteristics, they're not going to live on. And so a perfect example comes from the article on cracked.com, which is right here. And so if you go to this website, Cracked is an interesting website. They have very satirical articles on them, and they are based on fact. However, they like to poke fun at a lot of different things, and so sometimes they're very fun articles to read. But this article talks about 6 different ways that nature cleans up our messes better than we do, and that is an example of natural selection. So the best example of this here are the worms that eat heavy metals. So heavy metals were introduced into the soil in this region, and you have your population of worms that live in the soil. Now, some of these worms have the genetic makeup to be able to eat soil with heavy metals and survive, and other members of that same population don't have that genetic makeup. If they eat the soil with the heavy metals in it, they die. So therefore, a select few members of the population that have the ability to consume heavy metals and survive, those worms are going to live on and pass along their genetic information to their offspring, creating more offspring that are viable under the new environmental conditions. So go ahead and read through this article. It's interesting, and it's just a good example of natural selection. So when a population of organisms is faced with an environmental stressor, the few members of that population that have the genetic makeup to survive will, and the other members won't. So we have 2 different species concepts here that we need to talk about. The biological species concept and the environmental species concept. So With the biological, basically, if you get a male and a female together, and they make a baby, and that baby is able to make more babies, then they're the same species. So it's essentially the capacity to intermingle your genetic code and make viable offspring. Now, a viable offspring is considered an organism that can make more offspring. So, for example, a donkey and a horse can make an offspring known as the mule, but the mule cannot make more mules. Therefore, the donkey and the horse are not technically the same species because they do not create a viable offspring. Okay? So, organisms that can freely interbreed are the same species, and that is the biological species concept. However, the environmental species concept takes it a step further to say that if the organisms would never, in their natural ecosystem, come together to interbreed, then they're not the same species. Essentially, these organisms do not occupy the same niche. And the example of this are nocturnal and diurnal skunks. So there's two different skunks in this case, and some mate, forage, carry out life functions during the night. Those are your nocturnal. And other skunks do the same, only they do it during the daytime. So because these skunks occupy a different niche, some living and foraging and doing their skunk duties during the nighttime, and others doing their skunk duties during the daytime, because they occupy different niches, they will not naturally in their ecosystem come together to breed. And therefore, underneath the environmental species concept, these organisms are separate species. However, if you get a daytime skunk and a nighttime skunk together, they can produce a viable offspring. So they would be the same species under the biological species concept, but they are not the same species under the environmental species concept because they do not occupy the same niche and would not naturally be interbreeding. And the good example of this is Darwin's finches. So Darwin is the guy who developed the concept of natural selection and essentially evolution. Started investigating evolution. And he studied in the Galapagos Islands. Now, on the Galapagos Islands, there are drastically different ecosystems. There are different plants, different climates, different organisms living on each island. Those islands broke up a long time ago from one island that had a population of birds that just for whatever reason chose not to migrate. That original population of birds now has evolved to be viable on their islands under their new conditions. Some of these birds are able to eat cactus on the island that has a lot of cacti on it. Other birds have long, slender, supple beaks that they can reach into a delicate flower and drink the nectar. Other birds on another island that's dominated by nuts have developed hard, stiff beaks that are able to crack open a nut for their food resource. So the birds have evolved different characteristics through the process of natural selection, and therefore they're different species according to the environmental species concept because these birds do not ever leave their island. They spend their entire life on the island in which they're born. However, if you were to take one bird from one island and another bird from another, they could produce a viable offspring. So here are your 5 kingdoms. And when you review the PDF, you'll see how I've grouped them into 5 kingdoms. Modern genetics essentially have dominated the Monera kingdom into the Archaea and the bacteria. I lump them together because that's traditionally the way we have learned it, and this is new developing research. So your kingdoms, I'm going to go from the right to the left, are your animals. Right, insects are part of the animal kingdom. And then you have your fungi, you see your mushroom there. Then you have your plants, And then you have your protists. Now, protists are curious little animals, okay, that don't fall into any other category. They are not bacteria. They are not technically plants, fungus, or animals. They are their own entity, and they occupy a full kingdom. They essentially are things like algae and some plankton. So that's your protist kingdom, more or less. You can think of it like algae and plankton. And then beyond that to the left, you have your Monera. And Monera are essentially your bacterias. So we have, again, from right to left, animals, fungus, plants, protists, and Monera. So with population ecology, you have to understand not only the size of the population in order to understand how that population is changing, but you also have to understand the area in which it's contained. So here we're talking about population density. Now, if you have one mouse in an acre of land, and you're trying to study how the mice population is changing, you have to take into account the area in which it lives, because if you had, one mouse in a square foot as opposed to one mouse in an acre, if you're not paying attention to the size of the land, that's not going to help you understand how that population is changing. So an acre of land with 100 mice obviously has a greater population density than an acre of land with one mouse. This also plays a role into the likelihood of predation. If you have a hawk flying over an acre of land and there's only one field mouse in that acre, the hawk isn't guaranteed to see that mouse in order to prey within that acre of land. However, if there's 1,000 field mice in this 1 acre of land, it's a sure bet that the hawk flying over is going to see these mice and go down and prey in that acre of land and get themselves dinner. So when we translate this to population size in terms of humans, there's a number of different things we have to take into account. When we're considering the Earth, you have to take into account the number of births as well as the number of deaths. So the lives coming into the planet and the lives going out. When we look at this on a local population, say within a country, you also have to take into account immigration as well as emigration. So putting these all together, to understand the growth rate, you have to take into consideration the birth rate minus the death rate, in addition to the immigration rate minus the emigration rate. So here's just that example where you can see the bacteria. Okay, so we have 20 generations in the matter of 10 hours, giving us over 1 million bacteria. So they're very versatile for the use of understanding evolution and genetics. So we've talked about carrying capacity before. Now we need to talk about environmental limits. And these are things that limit population size. You have density dependent and density independent factors. So density dependent factors are those things that the greater the density of organisms within an area, the greater the likelihood of predation, disease, and competition. I mean, think about that. Those of you who do come to campus, maybe you get sick every semester because you're around a densely populated area with people who are bringing the common cold to class. However, if you were to stay home, being the only person in your house, not interacting with anyone else in the population, the likelihood of you getting sick is much less. If you're a moose and you're the only moose traveling around a forest and you don't encounter any other moose and you're carrying a moose cold, you're not going to pass that moose cold along. But if there's 100 other moose and you're passing by, your other moose members of your population, the likelihood of you passing along that cold is greater. So the more densely packed organisms are in an area, the more likely they are to be preyed upon, the more likely they are to spread disease, and the more likely they are to compete with each other. Now, density independent factors are those that are going to affect the entire population regardless of its size. If a wildfire happens in a forest, it's going to kill all the squirrels in the forest, whether it's one squirrel or 100. So that's the difference between density independent and density dependent factors.